I think, Ray, you're going to do a quick introduction, right?
Yes.
Okay.
We're ready?
Yep.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is another episode of the Three Amigos. We have Ron and Ed and myself, and this week is going to be kind of an extension of the conversation that Ron had last week as to the 5 things he looks for when he's buying a business. Today, Ed's going to give us more of a financial look at this, and he's got 7 things that he seeks when he's looking at purchasing a business, and he's going to go over it in more detail and then show you a financial chart so you get a better understanding of what that actually means. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to Ed, and Ed, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. Appreciate the introduction. You know, we all have talked about buying a business. It sounds so appealing to be your own boss, being independent, not working for somebody. But how many of us really have taken the plunge? So therefore, it still remains a dream. With that said, apparently it's a lot more difficult than we all think. And there's a lot of moving parts that have to be thought of. In this session, we're going to talk about 7 steps for successfully buying a business. These steps are not mutually exclusive. It must be done together to purchase a business at the right price while minimizing risk of surprises and disappointing results. During my career, I've had the opportunity of purchasing over 20 businesses. From this experience, I've learned a lot of what to do and what not to do. And I got to admit, I've been burned a few times. So I have a little bit of experience in this area that I'd like to share with everyone. And it comes down to basically, it's a risky proposition. It's not like buying real estate or buying a car. Businesses are complicated. They got many moving parts. Therefore, they have relationships with customers, employees, and vendors that have to be maintained. And there's always new regulation. And of course, there could be a black swan somewhere down the road, such as COVID-19 was. Mm-hmm. As a general concept, though, I'd like to say this: 80% of the businesses for sale do not sell. But that doesn't mean they couldn't if their owners did some proper planning and some improvements. Likewise, there's a great demand for good running businesses, and they cost a pretty penny. I think there is a real opportunity to purchase an underperforming business at a discount and improve with your knowledge and capital. It lends itself to a high potential purchase for those who have the experience, time, and capital to invest. So I kind of like to move it into the 7 steps and like to be able to chat about them a little bit here. Can you change the slide, someone?
Ron, you're on mute.
There are 7 steps that I'm proposing, and the first one is pretty obvious. Is the business right for you and your partners? I gotta tell you, small businesses are high risk. Most people in valuation say you should be looking at twice the return of the stock market, because that's how risky small businesses can be. So if the stock market was 12% over its history, you ought to be looking for something like 20 to 30%, somewhere in that range. If the results aren't there, you shouldn't buy the business. You should also buy the business to manage it as part of the board of directors, not to go in and try to run the business yourself. It's not a job, it's a business. So keep that in mind. Partners can really minimize the risk of buying a business. Assuming that you can get along, which is a big assumption, it helps raise more capital, but more importantly, from my perspective, the opportunity for collaboration. When you align yourself with different expertise and experience, you get that really uplifting, synergistic impact of the business that really could make a big difference. You need to know the value of the business. What's the value of the business to you personally? I got to tell you, there's some businesses I wouldn't own if I don't care how much they were making. I couldn't stomach being in the funeral business. That's just me. So it's personal, and that's important. And then there's 3 business valuation approaches that you should really be knowledgeable and run the numbers on to make sure you understand the value of the business as is, not improved, but as is. And they are basically the income approach, where you look at the future values of cash flows, the market approach, where you look at businesses that have sold that are like yours and what the multiples were and use that as a valuation. And then there's the cost approach if there's a liquidation. So, and you got to understand the impact of COVID-19 right now before you buy anything. So really dig your heels into that. The second one is, can you add value and unlock the true potential of the business? And as a starting point, I would want to be able to double or triple cash flow over the next 3 to 5 years. And the other thing I think is really important, where you really get a big impact, and we're going to talk about the numbers towards the end of this presentation, is where you increase the sales multiple. And you might ask, well, how do you do that? Well, if you were part of last week's presentation from Ron, digital adoption can be a big impact on your multiple. Customer stickiness, brand differentiators, superior management and system are all major factors that can improve the sales multiple of your business. Again, there's a great demand for businesses that are running well. And I think this is a good stopping point as we go through this process to hear from my partners in crime here, Ron and Ray. What do you guys think?
Well, I was going to say, before Ron steps in here, because you've had a chance to purchase 20 businesses on your own, Ed, give us some insights, because I think these were in relationship to your role as a COO. Is that correct?
CFO, COO, various controller, various positions throughout my career.
Right. What did you find when you bought these? Were you able to get the returns that you're recommending here in order to take a close look at the companies?
Yes, we did get the returns that we were looking for, because we were focused on making the hard decisions and moving forward. But the one thing, here's where Ron can weigh in. One of the biggest risks that you have is all of a sudden when you buy a business, there's a good possibility that some of the revenue will disappear. So you really have to do your due diligence on the revenue side and make sure there's a history there with the customers and there's nothing negative going on that's going to take away from the results of the purchase, because usually we're looking to increase revenue, right? Mm-hmm. So it's demoralizing if you have to take a step back after buying something and putting a lot of money into it, that you made a mistake, and you're not starting from X, you're starting at X minus Y, a lower number.
Right.
Yeah. Boy, and for people who just completed the purchase of the business in December or January and then have COVID hit, there's an example, a very extreme example that doesn't happen very often, but that can certainly, that's a reality. And we've probably all heard these horrible stories about people who just opened a restaurant or had just finalized a purchase, and then all of a sudden their revenue is dropping by 20, 30, 50, 100%. And so, but I don't think that's a normal circumstance. I don't think we want to judge everything we do by what's happening in COVID, this particular time. But there are other reasons why that could happen. One of the things we talked about briefly last week was the idea that if the owner is really involved and has all the relationships with the big customers, and it's a highly relationship driven business, then that can be a real surprise when somebody goes in and finds that they're not getting the business that they thought they would get anymore because that relationship no longer exists. Have a old client that was recently bought out by a large company, and I think that they made that mistake. They were so huge. It was an international company, 180, 200 years old, and they just thought, yeah, we can go in and pick up this little business here, 60, 70 employees, and it won't be a big deal. But they didn't really understand that the two owners together probably touched 80% of the customers that they had. And it's a very high dollar item. And so you didn't have to do, thousands of transactions. You only had to do, 50, 100 transactions a year in order to have a pretty substantial business. And so when COVID came along, they sort of arbitrarily said, thank you very much, you guys, but you're now too old to be here. We don't want to take the liability. And, I'm sure their business is off because the two guys who had developed this relationship over, for almost 50 years, it's gone. And so that can happen. And then there are a lot of other things that can happen too if you don't assess the markets correctly and you haven't quite understood the marketplace. And there's a change in a market that perhaps the owner knows that you didn't know. That certainly happens as well. So there are a variety of things that can surprise you. So I think, and I would just kind of suggest that as you're doing your numbers, you want to maybe, beef up your cash flow a little bit, or make sure you have access to capital, so that number three, so that if something did happen, you could quickly respond to that and try to mitigate that particular issue.
Undercapitalization is probably the biggest risk of a business, and I think more businesses go out of business because of that rather than not making money. So that's something that's really, really important. And when we talk about buying businesses, and we talk about it all the time, we're talking about a purchase price. Now let's say the purchase price is $3 million. Well, there's more to it than that, folks. You have to have working capital to run the business. And a lot of times the working capital requirements are just as high as the purchase price. So now instead of investing $4 million, you're investing $8 million. And then the final factor that's really going to make a difference is further investments in high ROI projects that can really make a difference to the profitability of the company. So you have to have that capital, and that kind of lends itself to more of a partnership purchase rather than trying to do it by yourself. And I think if you try to do it by yourself, unless you got a lot of money just sitting on the sidelines, I think it's a very difficult thing to accomplish.
You bring up a pretty good point, Ed, and it strikes me that it's possible that the seller may not have had access to capital, and it could have actually caused them to grow slower than they normally would have been able to do had they had the capital. So I suppose if you do have proper capitalization, then that can be a real asset, so to speak, to the purchase of the sale, and contribute something that the previous owner really didn't have, which was enough capital to be able to buy the next new big machine, or to enter another level of the market itself where maybe they didn't have access before, or buying into distribution that wasn't available previously. So I think I know you're right about that. And yes, people go out of business because they don't have any cash and can't pay their bills. Well, they don't have any cash and can't pay their bills because they didn't get enough capital to start with.
Well, which means you need in addition to the funds you have on the sideline that you'd like to invest, you need to have a line of credit with a bank that's adequate enough to do this to meet all the obligations and the timing differences that could come up and keeping the business afloat. The last thing you want to do is be asking for money when you dreadfully need it, because most likely you're not going to get it. So you got to plan in advance for that. So a line of credit with the bank is extremely important.
If I wanted to go back to a point you made that I think is extremely important, Ed. You talked about, suddenly losing business. And, I've seen that happen in several occasions when a company didn't look at the concentration of a client. There was a client relationship with the existing owner, and they decided to go someplace else. From your experience, how did you minimize that? Is there any tips you could pass on to people to avoid that loss of revenue, which only further exacerbates cash flow issues?
I like looking at the top 25 customers.
Okay.
Over a 5-year period. If that's available, that gives you a lot of information. You can track which customers are on the uptick, which ones are on the downtick.
Yeah.
And I think it gives you inside information on possible problems that could exist down the road. I don't think there's any way you could possibly buy a business without going through the top 25. And if you, I'm glad I wasn't that fly.
Sorry,
the one thing
I really hope that was actually a fly.
Yeah.
Or a mistake.
Every auditing book, every financial book you ever read, be careful about a business where they concentrate all their business in 1 or 2 customers.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, give us have you had any of those? 2 things I think would be helpful to the listeners is one, I think you just pointed out, watch out for concentrations. What does that mean to you? And what if the company doesn't have any information on their customer base that you could reliably analyze?
I wouldn't buy it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say that if they're so inept that they cannot give you basic information on their top, and I would say top 20%, not just 25 as a number, but top 20% of their customers, that you kind of have to, question whether or not the rest of the numbers, are right anyway. How can you grow a decent business if you have no idea, what your customers are doing? Now, having said that, as we talked, about last week, it's not enough just to know what their revenue is. You kind of have to understand their, the margins that are being generated by those customers too. That's harder to find. Many businesses don't have that information at the customer level. So I'm just going to throw this out, Ed. Wouldn't you discount your offer price if they don't have that information in order to mitigate the risk? If you were going to buy it, you're saying you don't want to buy it at all, but if you said, yeah, I think we're okay, but we're not really sure about this, so that's worth, that's a $50,000 reduction in the price we're going to offer.
Well, let's look at it from the seller's perspective. If he's got all the information, he or she can answer any question. The numbers look good. The working capital looks excellent. You got audited numbers. It's pretty hard for the buyer to discount the price of the business. But all good buyers are looking for every little nickel and dime aspect of the business to discount the price.
Right.
So if you're selling a business, you want to limit that risk as much as possible. If you're buying a business, you're going to look for everything to bring the price down. So that's a really good point. It's a give and take from the buyer and seller standpoint.
I can throw out another quick example. I'm involved in an REIT, and the LLC partner, we were thinking about selling out, and we were having this conversation with the LLC partner, and you know, it's like, okay, what would the price be? And of course, they have first right of refusal, and they would make an offer. So they had done they had just refinanced the project, and so there's an available. Well, I'm sorry, I've just lost. It just left my mind. But an assessment of the what do you call it when you have somebody come out and do a real estate estimate of the value?
An appraisal.
Appraisal, yeah, not an assessment, an appraisal. So they had just had an appraisal done, and that appraisal was available for us to look at. And as we take a look at that, then we say, well, what do you think about the price? And it said, well, because we're not actually selling the property, we would be buying your interest in the property. We will discount it for the unknown factors. We will discount that between 20 and 30%. So that's a pretty big number, and they do that on a continual basis. And he said, look, we'll probably give you the best offer. If we don't, you can go, you go talk to any of the other owners, or you can take it to the open market. But trust me, we'll give you the best offer. Nobody is going to give you such a small discount as that. So that's kind of where these professionals are coming from.
Right.
Moving on here, because a lot of our conversation ties into steps 4 and 5. Step 4 is, how do you structure the deal to protect you and your partners? And do you buy the assets? Purchasers like to buy the assets. Why? Because they're not picking up any contingent liabilities. Sellers want to sell the stock. And there's tax consequences for both of those preferences. But as a buyer, if you're buying the stock, you're buying any potential contingent liability that exists with that company, because all of a sudden now you're a shareholder of the company. So you got to try to protect yourself on contingent liabilities so that something doesn't surprise you down the road. Other things to consider, whether you pay up front in cash or partly cashed up front and some type of an earn out. Obviously, the buyers and sellers have different opinions on that. One of the biggest things you got to make sure is that whoever's selling you the business is not going to start up a competing business against you in the near future. And this happens all the time in the restaurant business, from what I'm told, where they open up a restaurant a couple of miles away after they sold the business to somebody else, and all the customers go back to the original owner. That's a big risk. Also, and you may want to consider, rather than buying a company, you may want to consider buying a minority interest in a company. That way, the ownership gets some new capital. You're brought on board to be hopefully one of the new players, new ideas that can help turn the company around. So that's very important. You got to have buy-sell agreements and insurance in place for the owners, because owners do pass away, become incapacitated, and if they own 50% of the shares of the business, what's going to happen to the business? How are you going to transfer over that 50% ownership back to the people that are left to run the business? And how does the surviving family get the right compensation for the value of that business? Those are really important issues that have to be put together in legal documents. And also avoid legal disputes at all costs. You start putting things in with attorneys, you lose control, and it could take 5-6 years to resolve things. So you got to work with people, and you got to come up with solutions that are a win-win for both. And then probably the other thing we've talked about many times, part of exit strategy, when you buy a business, that's the best time to have your exit strategy. Right. I bought a business now, it would be an exit strategy of 5 to 10 years. If we had somebody who was 21 years old, maybe his exit strategy or her exit strategy could be 40 years. So got to have that in place so you know how to move forward and you don't get stuck with a business if you're not around to run it. Remember, when the owners are not around, the value of the business goes down significantly.
So Ed, we got about 10 minutes to wrap this up.
Okay, well, let me kind of move through the last three here. Number 5 is you got to perform due diligence to avoid surprises. We talked about the revenue surprise that does exist, but I would demand audited or reviewed financial statements, and you need to make sure that they're accounting for things properly and there's no surprises. Do your homework on numbers, trends, and purchase price adjustments, because when people want to sell, all of a sudden they want to say, well, this is really true income of the business that we decided not to take because we want to minimize our tax. Well, you got to make sure you understand it. Again, when the owner leaves, you got to bring in the cash flow that you think you were going to bring in as part of the justification.
Ed, can I ask a question here? Because, you know, in your case, you are the CPA and you are the CFO and you understand all this. For a person, let's say myself or somebody, or perhaps even Ron, and we're buying a business, what would you recommend for us to do to make sure that we get access to the information we need and how to interpret it?
You need to bring in the right skill set, the people that do this for a living that understand it, so that you have that advantage, and so that you're not buying something that's really going to be a problem. And unfortunately, we all know nobody wants to spend a couple $100 to protect themselves down the road, and it's really not a wise thing to do to buy something that you really don't understand what you're buying. A couple other points that are to consider is the cost structure of operating in the state of California, which changes every day, and it's not for the positive. And leases, be careful of leases. They're long-term liabilities that could have a major impact on your business. Sometimes leases go away. It could be an attractive retail site that's necessary for generating the revenue, and all of a sudden you're out. Or you're obligated to 10 years worth of lease payments that you're personally guaranteeing when you may not have a business to help support that. So that's something I would really, really spend some time with.
Now, Ed, is it true that that liability, once you assume it, is yours, whether the business goes well or not?
It pretty much, especially if you buy the stock, that's pretty much, yeah, it's your baby.
Yeah.
So the worst thing to do is to be working 100 hours a week on something that you spent a lot of money for and you're not making any money in return. That's kind of that's a sentence of death in the business world. Number 6 is extremely important to everything, and that is you need to do a top-down strategic plan that shows potential improvements, accountability. It shows your forecast with improvements, without improvements, so you know what type of value you're generating. And don't forget, this is something that all three of us have done before, and it's really important. A good SWOT analysis really is beneficial for figuring out where the opportunities to move forward with that business are. So that's pretty important also. And I like the forecast going out 3 to 5 years, because as we get together on a quarterly basis, you can see whether you're making any progress or not. And last but not least, item number 7 is who will run the business. The owner is leaving. Someone should be responsible for and capable of running that business besides you. I think when you buy a business, the best opportunity is to become part of the board of directors and manage the business from afar, but not be involved in the trenches making the day-to-day decisions. So you got to make sure you got the right talent on the bench, and that any real negatives, deficiencies have to be brought into the company so that you can take it to the next level. So you would want to document a succession plan. You want to change it to a high performance culture, which means not high wages, but more incentives for adding value to the company, which is very, very instrumental in getting everybody on the same team, keeping politics to a minimal, and valuing the business on an annual basis and rewarding people accordingly. So that is a brief, very brief description of the 7 steps, but it gives you an idea of some of the things you have to look for and be aware of and do your homework on before you spend really good money on buying a business. But I do want to show, ending this conversation, the impact of multipliers on buying a business and how you can add value. Can you switch to the number slide, please?
Yep.
This is the, and keep in mind, this is an example. This is something that can really, a couple line items here, looking at how it's operating now and what it could operate in an improved basis, and the increased value you could be adding to the bottom line. Ray and I have done this at several clients, and it really has made a major difference. And in 3 years, you can hit numbers similar to this. But we kind of always talk about, well, can you improve revenue by 100%? Can you double it over 5 years? Maybe not. Maybe it's only 50%. Maybe it's 75%. If it's the same number over 5 years, probably that's a deal stopper right there. I don't think I'd be have any interest in buying a business that wasn't growing on the revenue side. This example here, you're buying a business that's got a gross profit margin of 40%. If you can increase that gross profit margin by 50%, actually it's 150%, going from 2 million to 5 million with the double increase, with the increase in revenue that doubles. That's an incremental increase of $3 million. That's 150%. So we grew our revenue by 100%. We grew our gross profit margin by 150%. And then if we control our fixed costs, now we're looking at 2.5 million of incremental cash flow. And that's a 250% increase in cash flow. And that's a really meaningful number.
Yeah.
Now, if you go one step further, and this is where a lot of people miss out on the point, but you got to increase that sales multiple. And if you can, it's got a profound impact, because the value of the business, your cash flow is 2.5 million that you've added. It's $3.5 million in total, but the valuation of the business goes from 4 million to 21 million, a $17 million improvement, a 425% increase in the valuation of the business. If you can get half of this, it's probably a good investment. But this is the potential, and this is why you need partners that can help on all these different lines of revenue and expenses, so you can optimize the business. And at that, I will shut up and leave it to you guys to close the meeting.
Ed, thank you. That was very good. It was helpful for us. I think, as you said, this is kind of an overview, and to make this meaningful, I think what's going to happen as we move forward is we're going to have to look at each of these 7 steps that you helped us kind of unspool and look at them in far deeper ways. So what I'm going to suggest is next week I'm going to look at step 7, which is who will run the business. How do you assess your bench, and how do you create a culture that really helps grow the business in terms of the numbers that you showed us at the end, that really makes something happen. So with that, I want to thank everybody. Ron, do you have anything you want to close with?
No, that's good.
Okay, Ed, thank you again so much. And this has been another edition of the Three Amigos. And today, Ed's kind of helped us understand what are the 7 most important things he looks at when he buys a business, given his experience of having purchased 20 of them as a COO and a CFO for companies with whom he worked. So thank you again, everyone. We'll see you again next week, and we'll go into more detail on how to assess the management team and to develop the right culture.